It was a quiet shift until the call came through. Unit 13, we have a disturbance at the old Ashford police station. Possible trespassing. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. I leaned forward in my patrol car, rubbing my eyes. Ashford had been decommissioned for almost 2 decades, sitting on the outskirts of town, gathering dust and legends. Every rookie heard the same ghost stories about it. Dead officers walking the halls and the missing prisoner whose screams could still be heard at night. All nonsense, of course, but the building still stood there, dark, cold, and abandoned. And tonight, it was my problem. I grabbed the radio. Copy. Dispatch. Unit 13 en route. I pulled up to the station a few minutes later. The entrance was chained, but someone had cut through it. The gates creaked as the wind howled, sweeping leaves across the cracked pavement. The place looked exactly as I remembered from the academy tour. Blackened windows, ivy choking the brick walls, and the faded emblem of the police department barely visible over the doors. No lights, no power, just silence. I parked the cruiser and stepped out, the air heavy and still, like a warning. There were no other cars around. I kept one hand near my holstered weapon and another on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark as I made my way to the entrance. A cold chill wrapped around me the moment I crossed the threshold. I radioed in, "Dispatch, I'm on site at Ashford. Looks quiet. Going to check inside." No response, just static. I exhaled sharply and moved deeper inside. The air smelled stale, dust and rot. My boots echoed against the cracked tiles bouncing off the walls of the narrow hallway. I reached the front desk, and for a moment I imagined it the way it used to be. Officers laughing, phones ringing, the buzz of a station alive with duty. But now, only silence. Then I heard it. A shuffle from down the hall. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, the beam slicing through the dark. "This is the police? Anyone in here?" No answer. Just the sound of something moving. Not a person, more like footsteps dragging unevenly, like someone was limping. I cursed under my breath, probably some homeless guy or teenagers playing around. But there was something about the sound, something too slow, too deliberate. I drew my gun. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. I stood still, listening. For a moment, everything was quiet again. Then the air shifted, and I heard a whisper. "Help me." It came from the holding cells down the corridor. I clenched my jaw, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe someone was trapped, an old junkie or a squatter. But how had they gotten locked inside? I moved carefully toward the cells, my flashlight flickering. The closer I got, the colder it became, like all the warmth had been sucked out of the air. Then I saw it. A cell door was open. Just one. It was the only part of the station with power, the flickering fluorescent light buzzing faintly above it. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. My flashlight sputtered again, and for a moment everything plunged into darkness. When it came back on, I saw him. A man stood inside the cell, facing the wall. He wore a torn prisoner's jumpsuit, his shoulders hunched, hair hanging over his face. "Sir," I called out, gun raised, "I need you to turn around slowly." He didn't move. The cold grew sharper, biting into my skin. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this man, whatever he was, needed help. "Are you hurt?" I asked, taking a step closer. "Do you need medical assistance?" Then, without warning, he turned. His eyes were sunken, lips pale and cracked. But the worst part was his expression. He was grinning, wide and unnatural, as if his mouth had been stretched too far. I stumbled back, heart slamming against my ribs. "You can't leave," he whispered, voice like a rasp. "They don't let you leave." Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut, trapping me inside the corridor. I spun around, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My flashlight flickered again, and when I turned back toward the cell, the man was gone. Panic surged through me. I reached for my radio, but it only hissed with static. "Dispatch, this is Unit 13. I'm trapped inside Ashford. Need assistance." No response. Then I heard something worse, more footsteps. Not just one pair. Dozens. They echoed down the hall, coming from all directions, slow and heavy, like boots dragging across the floor. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic beams against the walls. Shadows twisted and moved in ways they shouldn't. Figures started to appear, faint at first, like smudges in the dark. But as the light flickered again, I saw them clearly. Officers. They were dressed in old uniforms, some stained with blood, others with faces twisted in agony. Their eyes were blank, lifeless, and all of them were walking toward me. One of them, a tall officer with half his face missing, stepped forward, lifting a bony hand to point at me. His voice was a guttural growl. "You don't belong here." I stumbled backward, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My flashlight finally gave out, plunging everything into pitch black darkness. Then the whispers started. "Join us. Stay with us." The cold deepened, and I could feel them getting closer. Too close. Their icy breath brushed against my neck, and I knew if I stayed another second, I wouldn't leave this place alive. With every ounce of strength, I threw myself at the door again, slamming my shoulder into it. It groaned, the metal bending slightly. I kicked it, desperate, and finally it gave way. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, and sprinted toward the exit. The whispers followed me, growing louder, begging me to stay. "Don't leave. Don't leave." I didn't stop running until I burst through the front doors, nearly tripping over the broken chain. The cold vanished the moment I hit the pavement, replaced by the warm night air. I collapsed against my car, chest heaving, and grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 13. I need backup at Ashford Station. There's something inside." Finally, the radio crackled to life. "Unit 13, we've been trying to reach you. There's no Ashford Station. That place was demolished 5 years ago. Are you sure you're at the right location?" I stared at the building. The cracked windows, the ivy-covered walls, it was all still there. And then, the lights inside the station flickered one last time, and the door swung shut with a loud final clank. I didn't wait for backup. I got in my car and sped away, never looking back. But every time I pass that part of town, I swear I can still hear them whispering, "Come back. You belong with us." Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was a foggy night when Officer Jake Larson was assigned to the midnight patrol. He didn't like the graveyard shift, but as the rookie of the department, he didn't have much of a choice. It wasn't the dark or quiet that bothered him. He actually preferred that to the hustle of daytime patrols. But something about these shifts always felt off. Larson had heard stories, of course. The other officers would swap tales of strange sightings on the outskirts of town, of phantom figures lurking near the old abandoned station. But Larson wasn't the superstitious type. He chalked it up to stress or too much coffee, and the creepy stories were just a way for the guys to pass time during the slower nights. Still, tonight felt different. His radio crackled, interrupting his thoughts. "Unit 56 report. You there, Jake?" Larson picked up the receiver. "Yeah, I'm here." "What's up?" "Got a call from the old Jackson warehouse. Some kids reported seeing movement inside. Probably nothing, but can you check it out?" "On it," Larson replied, pulling a U-turn and heading toward the warehouse. The Jackson warehouse had been abandoned for years. There had been rumors of drug deals going on there, but nothing had ever been confirmed. The place was creepy as hell, though. Tall, looming walls covered in graffiti, broken windows like dark, soulless eyes, and the eerie silence that made the place seem alive, waiting. Larson parked his cruiser a few yards from the building and grabbed his flashlight. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for an October night. He felt a chill creep up his spine as he approached the massive, rusted doors. "Dispatch, I'm on scene." "Going in to check," he said into the radio, though his voice sounded unsure even to himself. He pushed open the door, which groaned in protest, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness of the warehouse. Inside, it was darker than he expected. His flashlight barely cut through the thick, musty air. "Probably just rats," he muttered under his breath. He moved deeper into the building, his footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris. The light from his flashlight flickered slightly, making his heart jump. He smacked it against his palm a few times, and the beam steadied. As he swept the light around the room, something caught his eye, a shadow darting across the far corner of the room. Larson froze. He hadn't heard anything. No footsteps, no rustling, just the movement. "Hello?" His voice echoed. "This is Officer Larson, County Police. If anyone's here, show yourself." Nothing. His pulse quickened, and for the first time that night, a wave of unease washed over him. He was alone, but every instinct screamed that he wasn't. Larson stepped forward cautiously, his light trembling slightly. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from the metal staircase to his left. He swung the beam toward the sound. The staircase was empty, but the door at the top of the stairs was ajar. It hadn't been before. "Dispatch, I think I've got someone in here. I'm checking upstairs." He moved slowly up the stairs, each creak and groan of the metal making his nerves buzz. As he reached the top, he nudged the door open with his foot, holding his breath. The room beyond was small, cluttered with old boxes and rotting furniture. The smell of mildew was thick in the air. But it wasn't the smell that made Larson's skin crawl. It was the figure standing in the corner facing the wall. A woman. She wore a long, tattered dress, her hair matted and covering her face. She didn't move, didn't seem to hear him. Larson's heart raced, but he forced himself to speak. "Ma'am, are you okay?" No response. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around." Slowly. Still nothing. Just the eerie silence of the room. Larson stepped closer, every fiber of his being telling him to turn around and leave. But he had a job to do. "Ma'am, I'm warning you. Turn around now." And then she moved. But she didn't turn. She glided. Her feet didn't move, but her body twisted unnaturally, her head snapping toward him like a marionette. The face that met his eyes wasn't human. It was pale, hollow, with deep black eyes that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. Larson stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. The radio on his belt crackled. "Jake? Jake? Do you hear me?" The voice wasn't from dispatch. It was a low, guttural rasp, the voice of something ancient, something wrong. The woman, or whatever it was, began to move toward him, her mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. Larson's hand shot to his gun, but before he could draw it, the lights in the room went out completely. The darkness was suffocating. He fumbled for his flashlight, but it was dead. The only sound was the pounding of his heart and the faint scrape of footsteps moving closer. He could feel her icy presence just inches away. Larson ran. He didn't care where. He barreled down the stairs, his mind racing. The air was thick, heavy, like trying to breathe through water. He made it to the main floor and sprinted toward the exit. But the door was gone. Panic surged through him. The warehouse seemed endless, every wall the same, every corner leading him back to the same spot. The shadowy figure followed him, always just behind, whispering his name in that voice that wasn't human. "Jake, come back." He wasn't even sure how he made it out. One second he was running, the next he was stumbling onto the street, gasping for air. His cruiser was in sight. Larson dove for it, slamming the door shut and locking it behind him. He sat there, shaking, staring at the dark warehouse. His radio crackled again, and this time it was dispatch. "Larson, you there? We've been trying to reach you for hours." Larson looked at his watch. It was 5 a.m. He had been inside for 5 minutes, maybe less. But outside, hours had passed. "Get back to the station, Jake," the voice over the radio urged. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was just past midnight when the call came in. "Unit 7, we've got a 911. Abandoned vehicle on Route 13. Witness says someone's inside. Possible driver passed out. Check it out." The dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio. I sighed, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes. Route 13 was notorious. Nothing good ever happened there. Accidents, disappearances, and the occasional drunk crashing into a ditch. No officer liked going down that road after dark. But orders were orders. "Copy, dispatch. Unit 7 en route." The wind howled as I steered my cruiser toward the highway, the flashing lights from the roof cutting through the thick mist curling over the road. The place had a strange feel at night, like the darkness was deeper, heavier. I'd heard the stories from other cops, things they claimed to see on the late shift, cars that vanished, figures standing by the road that disappeared when you blinked. I always chalked it up to tired minds playing tricks, but tonight felt different. I spotted the car just a few minutes later, a black sedan parked awkwardly on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. It looked empty at first, but as I got closer, I saw the figure in the driver's seat. Head slumped forward, no movement. "Dispatch, I have eyes on the vehicle. Investigating now." I parked behind it, flicked on my flashlight, and approached cautiously. The air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I rapped on the driver's window with the flashlight. "Police, sir, are you okay?" No response. I tried the door handle. It clicked open with ease. The moment I pulled it, the dome light flickered on, casting a weak yellow glow over the interior. The man inside looked dead. His skin was pale, his face slack, and his clothes were soaked with sweat. For a moment, I thought he wasn't breathing, but then he stirred, just barely, his eyes fluttering open. I leaned in. "Sir, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" He didn't answer. His gaze was glassy, unfocused, like he was looking at something far away. Then slowly his lips began to move. "They won't let me go," he whispered, voice raspy and weak. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. "Who won't let you go?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. His eyes flicked to mine, wide with terror. "They're in the car." I froze. My flashlight beam swept over the back seat. Empty. "Sir, there's no one else here," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, the hairs on my arms stood on end. The man gripped my wrist with surprising strength. Don't look in the mirror. Don't." His voice cracked, panic overtaking him. Before I could respond, he convulsed violently, his back arching against the seat. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his eyes rolled back. "Stay with me," I shouted, grabbing my radio. "Dispatch, I need an ambulance on Route 13. Driver is unresponsive." Then I saw it. The rear-view mirror tilted slightly on its own, just a small shift, barely noticeable, but it sent ice through my veins, and then something moved in the reflection. For a second, I thought it was a trick of the fog, but no. There was a face staring back at me from the mirror. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the driver's either. It was pale and twisted, with hollow eyes and a grin too wide for any human mouth. And it was watching me. The driver gasped one final time, then went still, his body slack and lifeless. But the thing in the mirror, it smiled wider. "Dispatch," I shouted into the radio, panic rising in my chest. "I need backup." The radio cut to static. And then the back door of the sedan creaked open on its own. The cold hit me like a punch, freezing my breath in my throat. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my ears, gun half raised. The car door slammed shut and the entire vehicle began to shake, as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. I backed away toward my cruiser, hands trembling. Whatever was in that car, it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could fight. The hazard lights blinked faster, almost frantically. The reflection in the rearview mirror twisted and warped, the grinning face turning more monstrous by the second. And then, the engine roared to life. The car jerked forward, tires screeching on the asphalt, swerving wildly as if an invisible hand was behind the wheel. I barely had time to dive out of the way before it shot down the highway, taillights disappearing into the mist. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath, and grabbed my radio again. "Dispatch, the vehicle just fled south on Route 13. I need backup. Something's wrong." Before I could finish, the engine of my cruiser roared to life. I turned just in time to see the lights on my patrol car flash on by themselves. The doors locked with a loud click, and the rearview mirror inside tilted. For one brief second, I saw it again, that grinning face staring back at me. And then, just as the sedan had done, my cruiser lurched forward. The wheels spun violently, the tires shrieking as the car moved toward me. I jumped out of the way at the last second, hitting the pavement hard as the cruiser sped off, vanishing into the night. I lay there, gasping, heart hammering in my chest. The cold clung to me, even as the mist began to thin, and in the silence that followed, I heard it, just faintly, carried on the wind. Laughter. Low, guttural, and inhuman. I stayed on the ground until another patrol arrived. They found me there, shivering, pale, and barely able to speak. When I told them what happened, they didn't believe me, said I must have fallen asleep or had a panic attack. But I know what I saw, and now every time I look into a rearview mirror, I see it. That twisted, grinning face. It's waiting for me. And one day, it's going to take me for a ride. Story the end.
Story number 4.
Officer Tom Reed hated patrolling Highway 39 at night. The road was desolate, stretching through miles of dense woods with no sign of life. Locals often called it Dead Man's Stretch, a nickname he laughed off but secretly believed. There had been too many accidents, too many strange occurrences on this road for his liking. But duty called, and tonight he was the only unit assigned to the highway. As he cruised down the dimly lit road, his headlights barely cut through the thick fog rolling in from the forest. The clock on his dashboard read 2:34 a.m., the dead of night. Tom sipped his lukewarm coffee, trying to shake off the creeping fatigue. He still had a few more hours on patrol, and the quiet was unnerving. His radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 74, we've received a call about a stranded vehicle near mile marker 26, possible broken down car. Can you check it out? Tom sighed and keyed the mic. 10-4 dispatch, heading there now. It was probably nothing. A flat tire or a dead battery. He'd been on dozens of these calls, but something about tonight felt wrong. He couldn't shake the unease settling in his gut, a feeling that had started ever since he left the station. The drive to mile marker 26 was slow, the fog getting thicker the closer he got. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught something, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Tom hit the brakes hard, his heart skipping a beat. The car skidded slightly on the wet pavement, coming to a stop just a few feet from the figure. It was a man. He stood motionless, wearing what looked like a long, dark coat, his face hidden by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. Something about him seemed off, though. His stance was too rigid, too unnatural. Tom rolled down his window. Hey, are you all right? No response. The man didn't move, didn't even flinch at the sound of Tom's voice. The air in the car suddenly felt colder, and a chill crawled up Tom's spine. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, keeping his hand near his holster just in case. As he approached, the fog swirled around the man, almost like it was clinging to him. "Sir, I need you to step off the road. It's dangerous out here." Still no response. Tom circled around awfully, trying to get a better look at the man's face, but the fog seemed to thicken the closer he got. His heart raced, a primal fear gnawing at him, though he couldn't explain why. He raised the flashlight, shining it directly at the man's face. Nothing. The beam passed through the man like he wasn't even there. Tom froze, his blood turning to ice. The man wasn't a man at all, just a shadow, a figure made of mist. And then, slowly, the figure turned its head toward him. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow pits of darkness staring right through him. Tom stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the spot. The figure tilted its head as if studying him, and then it spoke, not with words but in Tom's mind. "Turn back." The voice was low, guttural, filled with a terrible weight. Tom felt it echoing through his skull, vibrating deep in his bones. "Turn back, or you'll never leave." Before he could process what was happening, the figure vanished, dissolving into the fog as if it had never been there. Tom's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He stumbled back to his cruiser, slamming the door shut, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. He needed to get out of here now, but just as he started the engine, his radio crackled again. "Unit 74, we've got another report of a stranded vehicle, this time near mile marker 23. Can you investigate?" Tom's eyes shot to the dashboard. Mile marker 23 was just 3 miles back, the same direction he had come from. His heart sank. 10-4 dispatch, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll check it out." With trembling hands, he turned the cruiser around, heading back down the highway. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Tom's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he drove, his eyes darting from side to side, expecting the shadow to reappear at any moment. As he neared mile marker 23, the fog thinned just enough for him to see the outline of a car on the shoulder, a black sedan with its hazard lights blinking faintly through the mist. Tom pulled over and stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the haze. He approached the car cautiously, his senses on high alert. The driver's side door was open, but no one was inside. "Hello?" he called out. "This is Officer Reed with County Police. Is anyone here?" Silence. Only the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Tom's hand hovered over his radio, ready to call for backup when he noticed something strange. There were no footprints leading away from the car, no sign that anyone had been there at all. He circled the vehicle, his pulse quickening, and then he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the woods, barely visible through the fog. It was the same man from before, the same dark coat, the same wide-brimmed hat. Tom's blood ran cold. Without thinking, he drew his gun. "Stay where you are. Don't move." The figure didn't react. It just stood there, watching him. And then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed down the road. Tom followed the gesture, and his heart nearly stopped. 100 yards away, just visible through the swirling mist, was another car, a police cruiser. His cruiser. The door was open, and he could see himself sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, motionless. "No," Tom whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." The figure in the woods tilted its head again, and Tom felt that same voice creep into his mind. "You've been here before." Before Tom could react, the world around him seemed to warp, the fog closing in, swallowing him whole. And then everything went dark. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I was alone in the precinct that night, graveyard shift, babysitting an empty station while the rest of the city slept. It was supposed to be an easy shift. No arrests, no cases, no paperwork. Just me, my coffee, and the radio, waiting for the night to crawl by. At around 2:45 a.m., the rain started hammering the windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I leaned back in my chair, ready to fight off another wave of exhaustion, when the front door creaked open. The station bell jingled softly, something we kept to alert us when anyone walked in. I frowned. No one ever came in this late, especially not on a night like this. "Hello?" I called, standing up from my desk. There was no answer, just the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, making their way across the tiled floor toward the front desk. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, casting a beam across the dark lobby. Nobody, but I could still hear the steps growing closer. "Police department," I called again, louder this time. "Who's there?" The steps stopped abruptly, right at the edge of the desk. My pulse quickened. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain outside, pounding against the glass. Then the front desk phone rang, loud and shrill, shattering the silence. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. The phone hadn't worked in years. We'd switched to a new system months ago, but somehow the old line was still connected to something. I hesitated before picking it up, the cold plastic of the receiver pressing against my ear. "Police station?" I said cautiously. There was silence on the other end, just the faint crackle of static. Then a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have let him in." A chill swept down my spine. I slammed the phone down and scanned the lobby with my flashlight. It was empty. But something felt wrong, like the room had shifted, as if I were no longer alone. Then I noticed it. Wet footprints. They started just inside the doorway, leading straight toward the desk, stopping exactly where I'd heard the footsteps. The prints were strange, too large to be from regular shoes, like bare feet, but wider, with toes that seemed too long. My heart hammered as I followed the trail. It led down the hallway toward the holding cells. I knew nobody was supposed to be back there. There'd been no arrests that night. And yet, I could hear something moving in the back. A low shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the concrete floor. My hand went to my sidearm. I wasn't going to take any chances. I moved slowly down the corridor, the wet footprints glistening under my flashlight. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the walls seeming to close in around me. I reached the holding cells, and the sound stopped. All the cell doors were open except one, the very last one at the far end of the hall. That door was shut, and inside I could hear breathing. It was shallow and ragged, like someone or something was struggling to stay quiet. "Police," I called out. "Come out slowly. Let me see your hands." No response. I stepped closer, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The breathing grew louder, more erratic. I could see movement now, a shadow shifting just behind the bars of the last cell. "Show yourself," I barked, heart racing. And then the door swung open on its own. There was nothing inside, just an empty cot, a rusted toilet, and walls stained with years of grime. But the air in the room was thick with something heavy, something wrong. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the cell, just beyond the edge of my flashlight beam, something moved. Not a person, not quite an animal, just a shape. A shifting mass of shadow, coiling and writhing like smoke trapped in a human form. It had no face, but I could feel it watching me. I took a step back, my hand tightening on the grip of my gun. "Stay right where you are," I warned, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The thing didn't listen. It lurched forward, faster than anything I'd ever seen, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. The cold hit me like a tidal wave, sucking the breath from my lungs. My flashlight flickered wildly, the beam struggling to keep hold of the thing's shifting form. Then it whispered, right in my ear, "You let me in." My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as the flashlight slipped from my hand and hit the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting twisted shadows across the walls. And in the dim light, I saw it, the thing's reflection in the metal bars. It wasn't just in the cell. It was everywhere, twisting, shifting, crawling toward me from every shadow in the room. I scrambled to my feet and bolted down the hallway, my breath ragged, heart pounding like a drum. The shadows chased me, whispering, laughing, their voices overlapping in a horrible chorus. "You can't leave. You brought me here. You'll stay forever." I hit the lobby at full speed, slamming through the doors and into the pouring rain. I didn't stop running until I reached my cruiser. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I need backup at the station. Now. There's..." Before I could finish, the radio crackled again, and that same whispering voice came through the speaker. "You let me in." The engine roared to life without me touching the key. The cruiser's lights flickered on, flashing red and blue across the wet pavement. I stared in horror as the rearview mirror tilted, just slightly, catching the reflection of the dark station behind me. And in that reflection, I saw him. A twisted figure, grinning from the shadows inside the building. He raised a hand slowly, waving at me. I slammed the gas pedal, tearing down the road as fast as I could, the rain blurring everything around me. But no matter how far I drove, the whisper followed. "You can't run. You let me in. Now I'm with you. Always." The radio hissed, the voice fading into static, but I know it's not over. Every time I turn off the lights, every time I pass a shadowed alley or glance into a mirror, I see him. And one day, I know I'll hear that whisper again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Officer Sarah Collins sat alone in the squad car, her fingers tapping the steering wheel to a rhythm only she could hear. The station had been quiet that night, too quiet. She had volunteered for the night shift because she liked the peace, but tonight felt different. The stillness wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. "Collins, you there?" The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" Sarah replied, grateful for the break in silence. "We got a 1037, suspicious activity, reported at the old Silverton station. Some lights flickering, probably just a wiring issue, but you're the closest unit. Mind checking it out?" Sarah frowned. The Silverton station had been closed for years. It was an old, decaying building, abandoned after the town had moved operations to a newer facility on the other side of town. She had only been in there once when she first joined the force, and the place gave her the creeps. 10-4, dispatch. On my way. As she drove toward the station, the fog thickened, wrapping itself around the trees like ghostly fingers. The headlights of her cruiser barely cut through the haze, making the drive feel longer than it should have. The old station loomed ahead, its broken windows and crumbling brick walls looking more sinister in the dim glow of her headlights. Sarah parked the car and stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel. The air was cold, unnaturally so for a late October night. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself and grabbed her flashlight, shining it toward the station. "Dispatch! I'm at Silverton Station. Going to take a look around," she said, her voice low. "Copy that. Be careful out there." The doors to the station were unlocked, creaking as she pushed them open. Inside, it was worse than she remembered. Dust coated every surface, and the smell of mildew was thick in the air. The flickering lights the caller mentioned were easy to spot, one weak bulb hanging from a wire in the middle of the room. It swayed gently, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Sarah swept her flashlight around the room, but there was nothing. Just old desks, crumbling papers, and broken equipment left behind from years ago. Still, the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. Something wasn't right. She walked deeper into the station, her footsteps echoing in the hollow space. As she moved past one of the old holding cells, she thought she heard something, soft, like a whisper. She stopped, holding her breath, and listened. Nothing. Shaking her head, she continued forward, but the whisper came again, louder this time, like it was right behind her. "Sarah." Her blood turned to ice. She whipped around, shining her flashlight into the dark, but no one was there. The station was empty. She was sure of it. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. "This is Officer Collins. Show yourself." The silence stretched out, oppressive and thick, but then came a soft creak, like someone stepping on the old wooden floorboards. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the sound down the hallway. It led to the old interrogation room, a place she had avoided on her first visit. The door was slightly ajar, and a thin line of light spilled out into the hallway. That was impossible. The electricity in this part of the station hadn't worked in years. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she remembered it, bare, cold, and empty, except for the single table and chair in the center. But something was different now. Sitting at the table was a man. He was wearing an old-fashioned police uniform, the kind the force had abandoned decades ago. His head was down, and he didn't acknowledge her. The room felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on her. "Sir?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "Do you need help?" No response. She stepped closer, her hand hovering over her gun. "Sir, you need to stand up slowly. This building is off limits." Still, he didn't move. Sarah's heart raced as she circled the table, trying to get a look at his face. His hat obscured his features, and his body seemed wrong. Like he wasn't solid, like he was more shadow than man. Suddenly, he moved. His head snapped up, and Sarah's flashlight flickered. For a brief moment, she saw his face, or what should have been a face. But it was hollow, just an empty black void where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should be. Sarah gasped, stumbling back. Her flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for her radio. "Dispatch, I need backup at Silverton Station now," she shouted, her voice tight with panic. The radio crackled, but there was no response. Then the whisper came again. "Sarah?" It was louder now, all around her, like it was inside her head. The man stood up slowly, his body twitching, moving unnaturally as he turned toward her. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls bending and twisting. She had to get out of there. Sarah bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her ears. But as she reached the hallway, the door slammed shut in front of her. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the air with strange guttural sounds she couldn't understand. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come here." The voice was right behind her now. She turned, pressing her back against the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure stood just a few feet away, his form shifting and warping in the darkness. He was closer now, too close. Sarah raised her gun, her hands shaking violently. "Stay back, I'm warning you." The figure paused for a moment, as if considering her words. Then, slowly, it tilted its head. The whisper was soft, almost sad. "You can't leave." Without warning, the lights flickered one last time and went out completely. The darkness swallowed her, and the last thing she heard was the echo of her own name, whispered from every corner of the room. Then, silence. Several hours later, a second patrol unit was dispatched to the Silverton station after losing contact with Officer Collins. They found her cruiser parked outside, but the station was empty. Her radio was still on the seat, her flashlight dead on the floor. Officer Sarah Collins was never seen again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It started as a quiet night. Too quiet. That's how you know trouble's coming in this job. The radio had been dead for hours, and I was parked outside an old convenience store, trying to stay awake. Then, the call came through. The one every cop dreads. Unit 4, respond to a disturbance at 6115 Dyer Street. Possible intruder. I rubbed my eyes and sat up straight. Something about that address gnawed at me. It was an abandoned house, boarded up for years. Kids sometimes snuck in looking for a thrill, but the place was off. Every officer in the precinct knew it was cursed, or haunted if you believe the stories. I didn't. "Unit 4 on the way," I said into the radio and flipped on my lights. As I pulled onto Dyer Street, the night felt heavier. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. When I reached the house, my headlights illuminated its sagging frame. The windows were shattered and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air, my boots crunching on the wet gravel. The house stood there like a forgotten corpse, rotting quietly in the dark. "Dispatch, I'm at 615 Dyer. No signs of movement yet. I'll check it out." There was no answer. Just static. That was my first red flag. I moved up the porch, the boards creaking under my weight. The front door swung open with a tired groan as I pushed it. The air inside was damp and smelled like mildew. "Police! Anyone inside?" I called out, my voice echoing through the house. No answer. Just the quiet hum of the night pressing in on me. I scanned the room with my flashlight, dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, an old TV smashed in the corner. Then I saw it. A phone, sitting on the floor. It was an old rotary phone, out of place and coated with dust like everything else. I tilted my head. Why would anyone bring a phone here? I stepped closer, shining my light on it. Suddenly, the phone rang. The shrill, mechanical buzz shattered the silence, making my heart jump into my throat. I stared at it, stunned. There was no power in the house. This thing shouldn't be working. I swallowed hard and reached for the receiver. The plastic felt icy against my skin as I lifted it to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaky. There was a pause, followed by a soft, raspy breath. Then a voice, low and cracked, whispered, "Help me." My chest tightened. "Who is this? Where are you?" The line crackled with static and the voice came again, louder this time. "He's here. Don't let him in." The phone went dead, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. I slammed the receiver down, heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn around and leave, but something told me that wouldn't matter. That's when I heard it. Footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking barefoot across the creaking wood. I drew my sidearm, keeping my flashlight pointed up the staircase. "Police, come out with your hands up." The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started coming down the stairs. I froze. My flashlight beam flickered slightly as I waited for someone to appear at the top of the stairs. The sound grew louder, closer, and yet I saw no one. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking. The footsteps kept coming, one step at a time, down and down, but there was no one in sight. It was like the air itself was moving. My radio crackled and the dispatcher's voice came through. "Unit 4, do you copy? We received another call from 615 Dyer. Are you inside?" My blood ran cold. "Dispatch, I'm already inside." "Who called?" I whispered into the radio, my hand shaking around the flashlight. The radio hissed, and then the voice returned. Not my dispatcher's voice. The same voice from the phone. "He's behind you." Every muscle in my body locked up, my breath hitched, my throat tightening as cold air swept over my neck. Slowly, so slowly, I turned around, flashlight aimed into the dark room behind me. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty living room. And then the flashlight flickered, and I saw him. A figure stood in the corner, hunched and pale, its body twisted in ways no human could move. Its face was long and stretched, with eyes too wide and a grin that looked like it had been carved into its skin. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me and smiling. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the thing in flashes. Each time the light hit it, it seemed to move just a little closer. I scrambled to grab the radio. "Dispatch! I need backup! Now!" The figure took a step forward. The radio hissed, and the voice whispered through the static. "It's too late." The lights in the house went out all at once. I was plunged into darkness. I could hear the thing's footsteps moving closer, its ragged breathing filling the room. Blind and terrified, I groped for the door, my fingers brushing the cold wood. I yanked it open and stumbled onto the porch, slamming the door shut behind me. I ran to my cruiser, breathing hard, and fumbled with the keys. The rain poured down in sheets, but all I could think about was getting away from that house. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse. As I sped away down the street, my radio crackled one last time. "Unit 4, the dispatcher's voice came through, calm and clear. "We just received a 911 call from your location." I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "From where?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. The dispatcher's voice didn't hesitate. "The call came from inside your cruiser." I slammed the brakes and looked in the rearview mirror. He was sitting in the back seat. Story the end.
Story number 8.
Officer Greg Harris was known for his no-nonsense approach to policing. He had seen it all in his 20 years on the force. Drugs, violence, petty crime. Nothing rattled him. At least, that's what he liked to believe. But there was one call he still couldn't explain. A call that haunted him, even years later. It was a chilly November night, the kind where the air cuts through your jacket, biting at your skin. Harris had been sitting in his squad car, parked at the corner of 5th and Mason, sipping on a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The streets were quiet, and the night felt endless. His radio crackled to life. "Unit 42, we've got a 911 call from 308 Brookfield Road. Sounds like a domestic disturbance. Neighbors reported shouting, and the line went dead." Harris frowned. Brookfield Road was a dead-end street at the edge of town, lined with old, run-down houses. It was mostly elderly residents living there now, the younger families having moved on years ago. 10-4, dispatch. I'm en route. He wasn't in a rush. Domestic disturbances were common enough, usually just arguments that had gotten out of hand. Still, something about the address made him uneasy. 308 Brookfield. He had been there before, though he couldn't quite remember why. As he turned onto the road, the streetlights grew fewer and dimmer, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks. The house at 308 was at the very end of the road, half hidden by overgrown trees. It was an old Victorian-style home, its once grand exterior now weathered and decayed. The windows were dark, and the place looked abandoned. Harris pulled up to the curb and stepped out of the car, his breath fogging in the cold air. He scanned the house, looking for signs of life, lights, movement, but saw nothing. "Dispatch, I'm at 308 Brookfield. Looks deserted," he said into his radio. "Copy, Unit 42. Caller was a neighbor. They mentioned hearing yelling and a woman screaming before the line went dead. No one has answered since." Harris clicked his flashlight on and walked up the creaky front steps. The door was slightly ajar. He hesitated. Something about this didn't feel right. "Police!" he called out, pushing the door open wider. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a dark, musty hallway. The smell of mildew and damp wood hit him as he stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. The house was cold, unnaturally cold, like the air inside hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like eerie decorations. "Hello? Anyone here?" Harris called again, his voice echoing through the empty house. Silence. He walked deeper into the house, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Every step felt wrong, like the air was pressing in on him, heavier with each breath. Suddenly, a noise, a soft thud from upstairs. Harris froze, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. "Dispatch, I've got movement upstairs." "I'm going to check it out." He moved cautiously up the staircase, each step groaning under his weight. The house seemed to get darker as he ascended, the beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the thick gloom. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before him, lined with closed doors. The sound had come from the far end. He moved slowly, his pulse quickening as he approached the last door. It was slightly ajar, just like the front door had been. He nudged it open with his foot, flashlight raised. The room beyond was a bedroom, old, dusty, and untouched by time. A large four-poster bed dominated the center of the room, its sheets yellowed with age. A mirror stood in the corner, cracked and streaked with dust. Harris swept the flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. "Anyone in here?" he asked, his voice more uncertain than before. Nothing. He took a step forward, and that's when he noticed something strange. The bedspread was disturbed, as if someone had just been lying there. But the dust around the bed was undisturbed, not thick and undisturbed like no one had stepped foot in this room for years. The hairs on the back of Harris's neck stood on end. Then suddenly the door slammed shut behind him. Harris spun around, his heart racing. He rushed to the door, yanking it open, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The hallway was empty, but something had changed. The air was different, colder, more oppressive. The whisper came next. "Help me." It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, fragile and full of despair. Harris's mouth went dry. "Who's there? Please, help me." The voice was closer now, right behind him. He spun around, but there was no one, just the empty room and the dust-covered furniture. His hand tightened on his flashlight as he scanned the room, his heart pounding. And then, in the cracked mirror, he saw her. A woman, standing just behind him, her face pale, her eyes hollow, staring at him with an expression of pure, unrelenting sadness. Her mouth moved, but the words came from everywhere at once, filling the room like a chorus of whispers. "Help me." Harris stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He turned to face her, but there was nothing. She wasn't there, just the mirror, reflecting an empty room. His radio crackled to life, startling him. "Unit 42, we've lost contact with the caller. Do you need backup?" Harris's hands were shaking. "Dispatch. There's something wrong here. I need backup at 308 Brookfield now." "Copy that. Units are en route. Stay safe, Harris." But Harris didn't feel safe. The house felt alive now, breathing around him, the walls whispering in low, barely audible voices. He backed out of the room, his flashlight shaking as he made his way down the stairs. As he reached the bottom, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Help me. Don't leave me." Harris ran for the door, yanking it open and stumbling out into the cold night air. He didn't stop until he reached his cruiser, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his keys. He drove away as fast as he could, leaving the house and its whispers behind him. When backup arrived 20 minutes later, they found the house empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs that anyone had been there in years, and there was no record of a call coming from 308 Brookfield. The house had been abandoned for over a decade, but Harris knew what he had heard, and even now on quiet nights he could still hear the whispers, faint and desperate, calling to him from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The clock ticked toward midnight as I sat at my desk, going through the pile of paperwork that never seemed to shrink. The precinct was unusually quiet, and with each passing minute the silence grew heavier. I glanced at the window, watching the rain pelt against the glass, creating a soothing rhythm that made it harder to stay alert. Just as I was about to pour another cup of stale coffee, the dispatch radio crackled to life, jolting me back to reality. Unit 12, we've received reports of strange noises coming from the old train station on Elm Street. Possible trespassers. Can you check it out? Copy that, dispatch. Unit 12 en route, I replied, trying to shake off the unease that settled in my stomach. The old train station had been abandoned for years, a crumbling relic from a time long gone. The stories surrounding it were notorious: ghost sightings, strange sounds, and those who claimed they saw figures moving in the windows. Most of it was just urban legend, but still, the hairs on my neck stood up. As I drove through the rain-slicked streets, the darkness enveloped me like a shroud. The station loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the night sky. I parked my cruiser and stepped out, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the fog that clung to the ground. The air felt thick as I approached the entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaking as I pushed them open. I shone my flashlight around the dilapidated interior. Old ticket counters, rusty benches, and faded posters clung to the walls, whispering tales of a forgotten era. "Anyone here?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. Silence enveloped me, thick and suffocating. As I stepped further inside, I noticed something, a flicker of movement near the far end of the platform. I froze, instinctively reaching for my radio. Dispatch, I think I've got something. Moving to investigate. My heart raced as I made my way toward the source of the movement. With each step, the floorboards groaned beneath me, sending shivers down my spine. The air grew colder, and I felt an unsettling presence around me, as if I were being watched. Then, I saw it. A shadow darting behind a pillar at the far end of the station. "Hey, stop!" I shouted, adrenaline surging through me. I sprinted toward it, but as I rounded the pillar, there was nothing there. Just an empty space, dimly lit by my flashlight. Dispatch, I think someone's playing games. I'm at the platform. No sign of anyone, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But deep down, I could feel a sense of dread creeping in. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it. A low whisper echoing from the ticket booth. It sent chills racing down my spine. Help, me. The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it felt like it was right next to me. Who's there? I called, my voice trembling. I approached the booth cautiously, my flashlight beam shaking. Is someone in there? No response, just the whispering wind that seemed to creep into the station. I stepped closer, peering through the dusty glass. The booth was empty, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. Then suddenly the lights flickered above me. I looked up, heart racing. The overhead bulbs flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the walls. I turned back to the booth, and that's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing just behind the glass. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, eyes wide with fear. I stumbled back, startled. "What do you want?" I shouted. "Are you okay?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, she pointed toward the back of the station. I squinted into the darkness, trying to see what she was pointing at. That's when the lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me. "Dispatch! I need backup! Now!" I shouted into the radio, but the static crackled and fizzled. I was cut off. The whispering returned, growing louder, swirling around me like a tempest. "Help me! Help me!" It echoed in my ears, relentless and haunting. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling in the dark until I finally flicked it back on. And the beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the booth again. The woman was gone. I took a step back, heart pounding, trying to shake off the dread that settled in my chest. But then, behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, and deliberate. They echoed through the empty station, sending a wave of terror crashing over me. I turned, shining my light toward the sound. My pulse quickened as I saw a shadow moving toward me, a dark shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Show yourself," I demanded, voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. But the figure only continued to approach, its form shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. The air grew colder and the whispers intensified, a cacophony of desperate voices. "Help me! Help us!" I stumbled back, heart racing as I swung my flashlight wildly, trying to find some escape from this nightmare. My mind raced through every horror story I'd heard about the station, about the spirits trapped here, unable to move on. Then as I stumbled toward the exit, I felt it, a cold hand gripping my arm. I froze, unable to turn around. The whispers surrounded me now, deafening. "Help us. Let us go." I yanked my arm away and sprinted toward the door, throwing it open and bursting into the rain-soaked night. The cold air hit me like a wall, and I didn't stop running until I was back in my cruiser, slamming the door shut behind me. As I fumbled with the keys, I heard it again. The whispers, now outside my window. "Help us. Let us go." I finally started the engine, tires screeching as I tore away from the station, the rain pounding against the windshield. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through me. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The woman stood at the edge of the station, watching me with those wide, terrified eyes, her mouth moving silently. I drove faster, not daring to look back, the echoes of the station's whispers following me into the night. Story the end.